Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We spent all day yesterday telling you the House was planning to vote on its budget resolution. At least that was the initial plan. And House leadership wasn't making it firmly clear if they were still planning to go ahead with it, as there were 4 Republican holdouts who were suggesting they would vote no. You couldn't afford to lose 4 votes with the margin Republicans were dealing with last night, so they bring this thing to the floor, and then they pull it. And members actually start to leave the Capitol.
Yeah, they were told to go home.
And then they're called back to vote again. And what happens? 3 of the holdouts flip, and the thing passes.
It's almost as if you were watching this in real time, as we all were. Magical 13 minutes passed. Donald Trump on the phone with the holdouts. I believe, Kailey, he flipped 2 of the 3 holdouts that made this all possible. 217, 215, the vote here. Remindingly, $1.5 trillion to $2 trillion in spending cuts to pay for $4.5 trillion in tax cuts. The math is still hard for some members here.
Well, certainly Tom Massey, the one Republican who insisted on still voting no, being one of them. And we heard this question asked in the cabinet meeting that took place at the White House just a while ago about not cutting Medicaid. The president maintains that he doesn't want it touched other than looking at fraud. The problem is the budget outline, which, yes, did not dictate cuts to Medicaid, did say the Energy and Commerce Committee needs to find $880 billion worth of cuts somewhere. The question is where, if not there.
That's why we keep hearing about Medicaid, because it seems inevitable to those reading the tea leaves here. Donald Trump on Truth Social following passage of the bill. I hope the House and Senate are able to agree on making the tax cuts permanent, he writes. In all caps, exclamation point. And that's where we start with Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who is on Capitol Hill, looking at the fine print and some very challenging math. Tyler, what happens next?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, I actually caught up with Senator Shelley Moore Capito, a Republican from West Virginia, on the Appropriations Committee earlier today, and she told me she congratulates the House, but that her chamber has some adjustments to do. There's a few different issues at play here, but as you mentioned, tax cuts, perhaps the most contentious. This House plan calling for $4.5 trillion. That is likely only enough runway to extend President Trump's 2017 tax plan. And we heard from the Senate Budget Chair, Lindsey Graham, who called this bill neither big nor beautiful when it comes to tax cuts, and says that he will work in order to try to make those tax cuts permanent. But also important to keep in mind here, there are a lot of other campaign promises when it comes to tax priorities that could be left out of this, including no taxes on tips, overtime pay, Social Security, a lower corporate tax rate for companies who try to move their manufacturing to the U.S. So all of this starting to bubble up for Republicans to try to find some additional pay-fors. And Joe and Kailey, those negotiations are already in full swing. Bloomberg News reporting that House Speaker Mike Johnson, Senate Majority Leader John Thune heading to the White House later today, and that White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles is expected here on Capitol Hill for a lunch shortly.
Yeah, after leaving the cabinet meeting that just took place at the White House early, Tyler. And as we just heard, Elon Musk there with the rest of the cabinet and the president talking about their efforts to cut costs. How is that working in tandem with the cuts that Congress is currently trying to find?
It's going to be very difficult, right? Because we are seeing potentially huge numbers when it comes to adding to the deficit. The Committee for a Responsible Budget estimating that this House plan at least would add at least $3 trillion. And particularly when we are looking for those cuts, you mentioned there how President Trump has vowed that Medicaid will not be impacted. But it's very difficult to see how the math outlined in this House plan would prevent that. $880 billion potentially could go towards Medicaid. If just for the exercise, all of that money was taken out of the program, it would slash the program's annual budget by 10% over the next 10 years. This could get very politically fraught for Republicans. I was struck by one database kept by NYU, which found that 37% of House Speaker Mike Johnson's constituents in Louisiana are on Medicaid. This is going to be a tricky vote ahead.
Indeed, there's still a lot of work left to do. Last night was really just step one. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on Capitol Hill for us. Thank you so much. Of course, I would point out that on this show, or Balance of Power, the late edition, yesterday, when we were still ahead of the vote and talking to lawmakers about that, we spoke with Congressman Brian Stile of Wisconsin, who was sounding pretty confident it would pass last night, even in the face of a lot of people questioning that.
That's true, but also perfectly articulated the push and pull here between two sides within the Republican conference. Remember, we're not even talking about Democratic members here. Some obviously concerned about the potential for cuts to Medicaid. We've spoken with some of them, including Nicole Malliotakis. She ended up being a yes. Others don't think that we're cutting enough to make good on the promise of tax cuts and Donald Trump's request to make this permanent. That's another big ask. And how you get these two together in the same room is going to be interesting.
Yeah, this is how the congressman phrased it to us yesterday.
To my colleagues on the right that say the reduction in spending is insufficient, I remind them that by passing this procedural vote today, it's simply a floor, that we can build on the spending and saving reforms. To my colleagues that think it's too much, I would offer them to really look hard and make sure that we're not simply measuring the inputs into some of our key programs, in particular Medicaid, but instead we're measuring the outputs.
So for more, we want to turn to another veteran of Capitol Hill, former congressman and former chair of the Ways and Means Committee, Kevin Brady, is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. He's now a spokesperson for the Alliance for Competitive Taxation, making him a pretty good person to talk to about all of this. Mr. Chairman, welcome back.
It's good to see you.
I would ask you if you were surprised that this ultimately passed last night, but it also wasn't without its challenges. And it makes me wonder, if it was that hard to just get this done initially, how hard is the next part going to be?
Yeah, I would like to tell you every step's easier, but it's not. It's just a different type of difficult. But there's no question. House Republicans defied expectations. Delivered more quickly, I think, than people expected. Lots of momentum. Coming off the floor last night, talking to members of Congress and leadership, tax writers, budget folks, they felt like, to Joe's point, they had found that common ground, that sort of that design that could move it through a near zero majority, if you think about it, just unprecedented that way. So, I don't think you can underestimate how important a step this is. Not that there's not more of them, and as the reporter said, launching right away in those reconciliation discussions with the Senate and the White House. I think they're hopeful that they can reach an agreement, hopefully in March, but certainly by early April is when the two new special elections, I think, that's right, seat those two members from Florida. So it looks like that's the timetable, and that too is a pretty prompt timetable.
I'm sure you remember what it was like to get a telephone call from the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. What did these members go through? What did Victoria Spartz hear when Donald Trump called the cell phone last night?
So I think I think to the House leadership credit, they had really narrowed the number of people who were on the fence to a surprisingly small number. And I think that's because of the work they had done in Budget Committee earlier that had really struck this deal. And so I think Congresswoman Sparks wanted to know the President administration was serious about those budget cuts, finding a way.
Is that a happy call, though? Is it, hey, how you doing, Kevin? I got a problem. Or is he upset when he calls and puts on the pressure when he needs to?
One, he's as you'd imagine, direct. No, it is not threatening. People understand. He's got a long memory. He's very successful in these primaries. You don't really have to say it much. My experience is he talks you through the need to move. In this case, it isn't even doing the tax cuts. It's creating the runway. It's a procedural step that allows you to build what tax reform, can land on, which is his top priority. So normally I think positive. And they were on the phone quite a while, so clearly they had a good conversation.
Yeah, well, while we would all love to know what exactly he said on those phone calls, we do know what exactly he said on True Social this morning, which is that he wants his 2017 tax cuts made permanent, and he can hope both chambers can get their heads around that. The problem is, if you look at what was outlined last night, $4.5 trillion the Ways and Means Committee has in terms of headway, that's just enough to extend the tax cuts. So how do they actually make permanence happen?
Yeah, so one, music to my ears on the permanence. That's clearly the most pro-growth for the country and for families, certainly Main Street businesses. So that's a good thing. I think their House and Senate Republicans are both headed the same direction on permanence. They're just coming at it from different directions.
Okay.
Different baselines, sort of different designs on how they get their bodies together.
Well, tell us more about that, because the Senate wants to do current baseline, right? So what difference does that make in the ultimate architecture of this policy?
So the bottom line is today, if Congress spends, our budget organization assumes that spending will go forever. If you have tax cuts, they assume they expire. So sort of different treatment of Congress's action. And so current policy based on basically levels it was spending and says, we assume in the budget that current policy will go on unless Congress changes. What that does is delivers a smaller deficit number for them to work through, allows them, I think, a clear path to permanency. But I think, too, the House, I think on the fiscal side of this, the House is saying, should we adopt current policy baseline? Because now they're current law. We still want to tether tax cuts to the spending cuts. So right now they sort of have like rock climbers. They have this static line, the higher the spending cuts climb, the higher the tax base climbs. And so I think that'll be one of the key discussions at the White House today.
Well, speak to that balance a little bit more, because people hear a lot of jargon, they billion, trillion, nothing matters anymore. The difference between extending and making permanent, knowing that we're talking about at the moment $2 trillion in cuts. Can we actually define that cost between these two options?
So you got to reconcile a lot of the design and a lot of the numbers on these things. Permanency really, Joe, is if you can pay for that for a decade. Yep. That in effect creates permanency. So that's
and $2 trillion is not enough for that.
No, it is not. In fact,
so what number do we need to be talking about?
Well, great question. I think it's shaped by the president's new tax proposals on overtime, on tips, on Social Security, SALT, and
because those could all be included here.
At the end of the day, my bet would be it will be in some form, because what I learned as Ways and Means Chairman is, you can pay attention to his tweets, but pay real attention to his campaign promises, because that's what he wants to deliver on. I know the Ways and Means Committee has been preparing options for the president since day one on those proposals. So they'll have to find a way to accommodate those priorities for the president. Yes, they will add money to that overall number. One of the questions is, are those permanent? You know what I mean? Or are those like pilot tax cuts to go a number of years, and then they're reassessed. So lots of way to sort of turn the Rubik's Cube, you know what I mean?
Yes,
try to make this work.
Well, one thing the president made clear again, and he actually said, I've said this over and over when he was asked about it in the cabinet meeting today, is that he doesn't want Medicaid to be touched. I think he referred to it as a read my lips thing, or that it won't be that, throwing it back to the first President Bush, I guess, Congressman. Yeah. Well, so I do wonder, though, when you consider the pots that are available, if that is not one of them, how steep do the cuts everywhere else in terms of discretionary spending really have to get?
So two thoughts. One, I think the president, House Republicans, Senate Republicans are all, I think, pretty much on the same page. Don't touch those Medicaid benefits, but touch the program that sends money to ineligible people. Waste money, goes to undocumented immigrants, issues like that. So there are significant numbers there, that can really turn the dial on savings while protecting Medicaid itself. And then the other cuts, if you think about it, just since COVID, our federal budget has grown by more than a third. It just exploded over the last 4 or 5 years. And it's not sustainable. I mean, we're running $2 trillion deficits just from the growth of that. So clearly, they've got to right-size it back down, you know what I mean, to a more manageable budget spending budget over time. And so I think that's where, to your question, where else do you need to go? You would start with, where have we grown over the last 4 years? And do we still need to be spending at COVID levels in a non-COVID world?
Just in our remaining moment, you're one of the principals of this group, Coalition for North American Trade.
Yeah. To
renegotiate the USMCA. Donald Trump says he's still headlong on Canada-Mexico tariffs April 2nd. Is that good for our economy?
It's not. In fact, I think the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trading bloc is the most consequential trading partnership in the world, has served us well in the past, and with the new agreement, the president renegotiate even stronger, especially as we seek to compete against the Chinas of the world. And so I think what our goal is to create a framework to keep that agreement in place when it expires in 2026 or is up for review. And I think those countries are very willing to sit down work the problems with President Trump, whether it's border or fentanyl or Chinese transshipments, in the U.S. I see a big willingness to try to figure out a way to keep this trading partnership going.
That's why some think they will never be implemented. Maybe you're one of them.
Yeah. Hard to know.
All right. We won't try to predict Donald Trump's next move with Kevin Brady. It's great to see you, Congressman. Always a pleasure to have the chairman with us here at the table in Washington. We'll assemble our panel next on the fastest show in politics. Stay with us alongside Kailey, Leinz. I'm Joe Mathieu. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
First cabinet meeting for the 47th president. Wednesday, Donald Trump convening the secretaries and the heads of various agencies at the White House today for the first time of this term so far. And it wasn't just those who have actually gone through the confirmation process in the Senate who were in attendance. Elon Musk was there as well, representing, of course, the Department of Government Efficiency in an effort to cost cutting, even though the White House also said earlier this week he is not the actual administrator of Doge. That's someone else named Amy Gleason, who's a holdover from when this was still the U.S. digital service. But nonetheless, it was Doge that Elon Musk was there to speak about. And President Trump commended those efforts as well, including talking about the actual dollar figure they're ultimately targeting here.
One of the most important initiatives is Doge, and we have cut billions and billions and billions of dollars. We're looking to get it maybe to $1 trillion. If we can do that, we're going to start getting to be at a point where we can think in terms of balancing budgets, believe it or not, something you haven't heard in many, many years, decades actually.
Not sure we've ever heard or seen a cabinet meeting that resolved into a round of applause, which all of the cabinet officials gave Elon Musk when they were asked openly by the president if they had a problem with them. He said he'd throw them out if they did. And Elon Musk did address the room sitting behind. He wasn't actually seated at the table.
Yes.
And we do want to be clear about that. There's fascinating reporting in the Washington Post today about the lair inside the Eisenhower Executive Office building right across the driveway from the White House where Elon Musk's office has been set up. It's in the old Secretary of War suite, where rainbow-colored lights emanate from the tower and keyboard of a powerful gaming computer he uses to conduct government business. Imagine the Alienware machine, right? A MAGA hat and a placard reading Doge sit on a large wooden desk, cord snaking across the carpet into a surge protector. It sounds like a dorm room.
Well, and if you were seeing on Bloomberg TV, on YouTube, or anywhere else, Elon Musk in the back of the cabinet room, standing at the side of the table, he was wearing a hat, a baseball cap, and
MAGA.
a tech support
t-shirt,
saying that essentially the work they're doing in that building you just described is tech support for the government, looking at software and things that are outdated, that kind of thing.
Let's see how the panel feels about this. They were listening and watching along with all of us, an hour-plus experience in the cabinet room. Jeanne Zaino is here, Bloomberg Politics contributor, our Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. And Republican strategist Maura Gillespie is back, Blue Stack Strategies. Great to see you both here. The optics that we're talking about, Jeanne, are pretty remarkable. To Kailey's point, Elon Musk said, "I call myself humble tech support here." Is that all he's doing in this administration?
Well, I think there may be more to it, but I was so glad to hear that he too has wires everywhere. Since I have wires in my office, I thought maybe the wealthiest man in the world ever could hide those wires. So I'm glad to hear I'm not alone. It was quite a sight. And, he talked very deferentially to obviously the president, as he normally would, and to the cabinet, given that we've heard, there was some perhaps consternation about the email that went out. The president said, "Oh, no, there wasn't." And as you said, if there was, they can just say now and get out. So they tried to present a very unified front. And I loved the fact that Donald Trump said, doging is now a verb, because he said many secretaries are going to be doging in their own departments in the next few days or the next few weeks, including, he said, the EPA, where he said Zeldin is prepared to cut 65% of the workforce, which is quite astonishing. So there was some news made there, but certainly, they were very clear optically that Elon Musk is not a member of the cabinet.
Well, as Jeanne talks about the consternation, or at least reported consternation, over the whole email asking federal employees to justify their jobs, or at least prove, if you're to use the word of Elon Musk, that they have a pulse by saying what they did last week. Maura, if there's not consternation, there at the very least is confusion, as there's been some mixed messaging from department heads, from the Office of Personnel Management specifically, as to whether or not a response is required. We heard the president describe those people, well over 1 million of them, who haven't responded as being, quote, on the bubble today. Are these people actually at risk of getting fired, or do we just not have clarity around that?
It does seem a bit confusing at the moment, and I don't know that this cabinet meeting answered some of those questions or alleviated that confusion. But I do think it's important that the DOJ entity gives the department heads a chance to clean house or to assess what's going on in their own department. Some of them, as the president did mention, only got in there 1-2 days ago. So, giving them a chance to take assessment of what's going on at their department, identify some of those fraud, waste, and abuse issues, whether that's pointed out by DOJ through a coordinated effort or an assistance from Elon Musk and his department, sure. But without allowing them even a chance, I think is what confused many. And there needs to be some clarity there. I am glad to hear that Elon Musk has an office there, because I think that coming in and making grand sweeping gestures and blanket statements about all federal employees and without having had any experience is a little bit immature, because coming in there and saying, name me 5 things you did this week, that varies based on week to week, and I don't think that that's really an effective use. So he did try and downplay that, which I was glad to hear. And I do think that there's some importance there in recognizing the different nuances, because government work, and at least from my experience, isn't necessarily glamorous. I don't think that people are banging on the doors. It's not like it's a money making machine. It's people wanted to do the right thing for the right reason for the large part. And so I think it's important to remember that these are people who went to work into government for attempts to leave it better than they found it.
Enter the gold card, Jeanne, that would create a path to citizenship for anyone who pays $5 million or more. This would be a replacement of the old, or I guess a reinstatement of the old EB-5 visa program. Donald Trump today saying if we sell 10 million highly productive people coming in, they'll be young, they'll be talented. That's $50 trillion. That means our debt is totally paid off. Did he just solve the puzzle?
He thinks he did, and he pushed back a little bit on Lutnick there, saying, he was using another number, but this could go much higher. And with Donald Trump's usual bombast, it was very optimistic. And in the clip you just played, of course, Donald Trump said something which is just stunning, that nobody in years has talked about eliminating the debt. In fact, he talked about it in 2016. He said he would eliminate the entire national debt. And what did he do? He added over $8 trillion to it in 10 years. And of course, this brings us to where we are headed. His gold card, which he is holding up as potentially a panacea for debt. Elon Musk talking about firing people or identifying people who don't even exist, who are receiving sums of money from the public dole. As Maura just said, this is not a money-making thing. And of course, you eliminate the entire federal employees, you're only at 5%. So the numbers they're using don't add up. And if Elon Musk really wants to make an impact, go after the contractors, because that is what some people refer to as the deep state. But of course, he can't do that since he himself is 38 billion in as a federal contractor at this point. So lots of what they say sound very exciting, and if they worked would be incredibly wonderful, but the numbers as usual are not adding up here.
Well, and we of course know what they were saying in that cabinet room today, in part because it was live, but also there were reporters there asking questions about the subjects that we've talked about and many others that we simply don't have the time to get to. All of those who were in the room, which of course has some space constraints considering you're just huddled around a cabinet table, part of the White House press pool, which had some changes effective today. Maura and Jeanne, as you're well aware, is the White House is now picking the group of outlets that can actually be represented in that pool. And today, 2 of the wire services, Associated Press and Reuters, were not part of it. Instead, Newsmax and Blaze Media were added. Instead, HuffPost also wasn't allowed to participate this time. That slot went to Axios. We should note Bloomberg also is a wire service and was allowed to participate in the pool today. But this is obviously a change in the way this has always been done. Usually, Maura, that is the White House Correspondents Association that is coordinating this, and wire services, which distribute news to outlets all across the country, have always, all three of them, had a seat on the plane or a spot in the room. What does this do to the way in which the information coming out of this administration and this White House is going to spread?
You know, if you listen to the press secretary talking about it, you would think, yeah, sure. And if you're a Republican, you would think, of course, we should decide to have, who gets to be in the room. It's a privilege, as she said, and all these things. I don't know that they're going to have the same tune in 4 or 8 years from now when, let's say, the Republicans don't win and they're not in the presidency. But you've now allowed this to be the case. You've allowed this to be the norm now. And so how will these members of the press feel, or how will these members of the public feel if they're Republican and now the Democratic president in control is dictating who can be in the room covering news the way that he wants it or she wants it covered? I think that it sets a terrible precedent moving forward. And there is a need for objectivity. And if nothing else, I wish people would look at it without having their Republican or Democratic lens on, and think about it from the standpoint of the freedom of the press and just the importance of having objective lenses in the room, asking tough questions, and they're free to answer however they feel. But this is cause for concern.
There was a time earlier in my career in a different spot, Jeanne, where it was my job to get a satellite radio channel assigned to the radio pool. It was not easy, and it ended up resolving in a vote among my peers. It was a successful vote, and we started as part of that rotation. What is the difference between the White House picking who's in the pool and the self-policing White House Correspondents Association?
Well, there's a big difference. The number one is that the White House, as Maura just mentioned, Republicans may not be happy who the next Democratic president or White House chooses to put in that pool. So it is very concerning. I think if we just think about it broadly, there is a reason that the framers of the Constitution put only one private business, if you will, into the Constitution, and that is the freedom of the press. It's that important to democracy.
All right, Jeanne, Zaino, and Maura Gillespie, our political panel today. Thank you so much for joining us as we follow what's happening at the White House, also on Capitol Hill, where we'll be going next after the passage of that House budget resolution last night. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts, or watch us live on YouTube.
We weren't sure we'd be talking about results from a vote, but it did happen last night. Even after at one point lawmakers were cleared from the House floor, they were sent home. They didn't have the votes. 13 minutes later, they did. 217, 215, Kailey, a big victory, one of many that will be required for Speaker Mike Johnson to close the deal on Donald Trump's agenda.
Yeah, a big victory, if not a big margin of victory. Right. This thing did come down to the wire. It was very, very close, and arguably there is still even harder work ahead, because this was, as we heard from lawmakers ourselves yesterday, just a blueprint. Now they actually have to iron out where these spending cuts are going to come from, whether the tax cuts will be made permanent as the Senate wants. It's still a lot of work left to do. And joining us now with a look from Capitol Hill is Republican Congressman Troy Downing of Montana, who represents Montana's 2nd District. Congressman, thanks so much for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Obviously, last night was a little bit dramatic, and I do wonder what you're hearing from your colleagues today on the path forward, given how much arm wrestling, including phone calls from the president, needed to happen just to get the blueprint passed.
Well, I'm going to tell you, I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I think it's a healthy process. I mean, we don't just all, automatically give an answer. We need an opportunity to talk about, to air our grievances, for lack of a better word. And I think it's a healthy process. But then we understand this is a team sport. We had to come together and actually pass this. And I think there's been, you mentioned it briefly, a lot of misconception. I mean, this resolution really is almost a procedural part, on the budget, where the real work begins on the committees. And, we're ready to start doing that work. Obviously, there's a lot of work that's going to come of that, but I think it'll go through that same process where we will debate at the committee level, figure out where we come together to get this all together, and ultimately get this into a bill to really make some changes that Donald Trump promised, that we all ran on, and that the American people want. And I'm excited about the opportunity to do this.
It does say a lot about the potential drama when just passing the instructions requires so much angst here. Congressman, we just had a conversation with Kevin Brady, the former chair of the Ways and Means Committee, who is charged with helping to get the Trump tax cuts not just extended but made permanent. He suggests this idea of cutting $2 trillion in spending is not nearly enough to pay for what the president wants. Do you agree?
Well, here's the thing, is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, it needs to be extended. That would be a 26% tax increase to Montanans if we don't get that extended. And that goes across the board, from every strata of taxpayer. And, one of the things that's really important to a lot of my constituents is making sure that death tax isn't repealed, because that could potentially start taking production agriculture out of production as heirs and farms and ranches in Montana have to sell to pay their taxes. Everybody thinks that this is some wealthy loophole, where the reality of it is a lot of these farmers, ranchers in Montana are very land rich and capital poor, and this would just start to destroy them. But I do think that we all ran on this. The American people want it, and we need to extend these. I've heard that the Senate is likely going to try to make these permanent. I personally think that that's a good idea. I think that's positive, but we have to go through the process and see where we actually get with that.
Well, and part of this process, or at least part of the math, if you listen to the words of the president, may include revenue that will come in because of tariffs he intends to implement. So as you talk about your constituents in Montana, how they would be affected by tax policy, I do wonder, both for your constituents and for the small businesses that you hear from as you sit on the small business committee, what you're hearing about the potential negative impact of tariffs that could go into place. As he once again today said, 25% on Mexican and Canadian goods, that's happening.
Right. And, where the administration falls on the tariffs or not, obviously in Congress we're not doing that part of it, but we are trying to be very thoughtful and make sure.
But I'm sure you're hearing about it.
Oh yes, of course we're hearing about it, and there's a lot of concern, and where that actually falls or doesn't fall, we'll continue to make sure that the administration understands what our concerns are. And I mean, there's two parts of it. You talk about the inflationary potential of it coming in, but you can balance that in tax policy. You talk about nobody wants a trade war. What's that mean as you export? We need to be very thoughtful about how surgical we are in applying that, because coming from an agricultural state, a lot of my producers are selling abroad, and we need to make sure that they're not disadvantaged. And these are the conversations we'll have with the administration to make sure that we are using a scalpel and not a sledgehammer when he starts to push out this tariff policy.
Well, Congressman, our viewers and listeners should know, before you got to Capitol Hill in this most recent Congress, you were a business owner, not just an Air Force veteran, but you were the founder and former CEO of a storage solutions company. You also founded a web calendar company. You sold to Yahoo, so you know what it's like to balance a budget. You know what it's like to face a balance sheet. And I wonder how important it is to you for these tax cuts, whether they're extended or made permanent, are paid for.
Yeah, well, here's the thing: is coming from the private sector, you understand, the fits and spurts of having to, balance your budget, for lack of a better word, making sure that you can stay afloat, making sure you have access to capital, making sure you can, pay your expenses, all of that stuff. And sometimes you need to downsize and regroup, and I think that's an important thing to think about. You see a lot of companies that get to a point where they have to, start to downsize as they restructure, and they always, well, not always, but often will come back stronger. And I think it's important to understand that. One of the things that's going on right now with DOGE is they're starting to uncover all of this wasteful spending. And I think a lot of the stuff that we're going to find and continue to find is that we're paying for a lot of things, overpaying for a lot of things that most Americans had no idea that we were involved in. And there's a recent poll that came out, I just saw it this morning, that shows between a supermajority, between 76 and 77% approve of what the president is doing. and rooting out this fraud, waste, and abuse. And so, one of the issues there that I think is important is to, understand that's going to start to release a lot of this potential, and we're not necessarily going to get fair CBO rating on that. And so I think it's important to keep that in your back pocket, that we might see a lot more than most people expected. But the American people voted for Trump to do what he's doing. And I'm very supportive of that, because in anything from private business to government, you need to root out wasteful spending, fraud, and abuse. And I'm happy that we're doing that.
Are there concerns, though, Congressman, around things that could get thrown out with that bathwater? When we consider the reductions in the federal workforce, specifically in the Office of Personnel Management, just sent out a memo today that agencies have till March 13th to essentially outline their plans for large-scale reductions in their workforces. Veterans, like yourself, make up a large chunk of the federal workforce. Are you worried about the people ultimately who could be affected by this?
Well, first of all, you never want to see anybody being affected like that. Obviously, the effect on that person's family is important. But on the other hand, we have to figure out where we're spending money. I mean, we were elected to be stewards to the people that elected us, to the people of the United States of America, making sure that we're being stewards to taxpayer money and doing the right thing. And so, as we start to look at these programs, we're going to have very serious conversations about what is in the interest of the United States of America, what is stewardship of taxpayer dollars. And there's going to be a lot of trimming of the fat. That is going to be part of it. I don't discount the fact that this will affect some people, and I don't discount that at all, but it's something that we have to do. We're at the precipice where we just don't have the ability as a country, the funds, to continue spending ourselves into oblivion. I think about my path of growing up without money, without family connections, without means, and being successful because of the opportunities I had as an American. And I worry about that being squandered with a complete lack of fiscal restraint. And I think that American dream, this country that was so good to me when I'm growing up, is harder and harder to achieve for this next generation and the generation after. I think of that brass ring of that American dream. I worry about how a young family starting out today ever has a path to buy their first house. I mean, that's the main part of that American dream, and we need to start clawing that back. I think a complete lack of fiscal constraint, a complete lack of stewardship for government funds, and it just comes down to economics 101. You keep pouring money into a system, it's not helping anything. It's an inflationary factor, and we need to start clawing that back so that we make it so that our kids have the opportunities that I did. We make it so they can buy that first house. We make it so they can be successful.
I appreciate the principle of what you're saying, Congressman, but I wonder if there should be a carve-out for veterans and veteran services. Not only are you a veteran yourself, but I know you work with Warriors and Quiet Waters Foundation.
Right.
The Post this morning reporting in Washington, DOJ canceling government contracts, 875 of them, that include support for medical and burial services, cancer programs, and efforts to recruit doctors for critical vacancies. Is there a space for nonprofit to fill this gap, or are you worried about what's happening?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of nonprofits that do fill those gaps. There's, upward of 65,000 veteran nonprofits in this country, and actually, that's old data. It might be more by now. But let me just be really clear. I will always stand up and support our veterans. And to the point that we start to lose programs that they're depending on, then I will stand up to that, because that is something that can't happen under my watch. What I'm seeing right now, and what I'm hopeful for, is we're starting to trim that fat that's not directly related to veteran services, but to the administrative side, parts where we can actually, trim the fat that is not directly related to services that we've promised and have been giving our veterans. And I will always stand up for that. The numbers that you just gave me, it's first I've heard, so I'm going to refrain from talking about that until I've had a chance to look at it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your answering that question, sir, and we thank you for your service. That's Congressman Troy Downing, Republican from Montana's 2nd District, with us live from Capitol Hill here on Bloomberg. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.